Imagine waking up every morning in the same room, the same walls, the same sounds, the same routines. You don't decide when you eat, when you leave, who enters your space, or even when you get a moment alone. At first, you might think the hardest part would be the lack of freedom, but something stranger can happen over time. You can begin to forget what freedom feels like. And that raises a disturbing question. What happens to a human mind when the world makes almost every decision for you? People often imagine prison changing someone through fear, violence, or punishment. Those things matter, but they may not be the deepest psychological change. Because the human brain doesn't just adapt to danger. It adapts to whatever environment it is repeatedly placed inside. And prison is an environment where control, uncertainty, surveillance, restricted choice, and the constant possibility of conflict become part of everyday life. At first, a person may fight that environment. They may count the days, imagine the life waiting outside, and tell themselves that when they get out, everything will be different. But years have a strange way of changing the meaning of those words. Eventually, the mind begins learning a different set of rules. Don't assume you have control. Don't expect privacy. Don't trust too quickly. Don't react too strongly, and pay attention to everything around you. The brain becomes extremely good at detecting signals that might matter. A normal person might walk into a room and barely notice who is standing there. Someone who has spent years in a dangerous or unpredictable environment may notice almost immediately who's watching, who's angry, who's approaching, what's happening behind me, what changed. That heightened awareness can be protective inside prison. But here's where the story becomes more complicated. A behavior that protects you in one environment can become a problem when the environment changes. Imagine living for years with your nervous system constantly scanning for threat. Then one day, you're outside. There is no locked door, no guard watching, no schedule telling you where to go. You can walk into a store and choose whatever you want. You can sit in a park without anyone telling you when to leave. It sounds like freedom. But psychologically, freedom isn't always experienced as freedom. Sometimes it feels like uncertainty, and uncertainty can be deeply uncomfortable when you've spent years learning to survive through rigid rules. This is one reason the transition out of prison can be psychologically difficult. A person may suddenly have to make decisions that most of us make without thinking. What time should I wake up? Who can I trust? How much money should I spend? What should I do today? How do I handle conflict without immediately becoming defensive? How do I build relationships when I have learned to protect myself from other people? These aren't simply practical questions. They're questions of identity. Because after enough time in a particular environment, you don't just learn how to survive there. You can begin to learn who you are there. And that's the part people often underestimate. A prison sentence has a calendar, but psychological adaptation doesn't necessarily stop when the calendar ends. The mind carries habits forward. Someone may continue avoiding eye contact because eye contact once felt threatening. They may sleep lightly because deep sleep once meant losing awareness of their surroundings. They may become uncomfortable in crowded spaces, struggle with intimacy, or distrust kindness because kindness can feel unfamiliar when relationships have often been transactional or dangerous. Sometimes the person doesn't even understand why they're behaving this way. That's what makes adaptation so powerful. We rarely experience our learned behaviors as learned behaviors. They simply feel like us. You don't wake up and think, my nervous system has developed a strategy based on years of environmental conditioning. You think, I'm just cautious. I'm just private. I don't like people getting too close. I feel better when I know exactly what's going to happen. And suddenly, prison reveals something uncomfortable about all of us. Because you don't need to be incarcerated to experience this process. Put a person in an environment long enough, and the environment begins teaching that person how to behave. A toxic workplace can teach someone to stop speaking honestly because every opinion is punished. A controlling relationship can teach someone to constantly monitor another person's mood. A chaotic childhood can teach someone to expect bad news even when everything is going well. A highly competitive environment can teach someone to measure their worth through achievement. Social media can teach someone to constantly monitor how they are being perceived. The surroundings change, but the mechanism is remarkably similar. We adapt, and adaptation has a hidden cost. The strategy that once helped you survive can become the strategy that prevents you from living. There is another psychological shift that can happen in prolonged confinement: the erosion of ordinary choice. Psychologists have studied what can happen when people repeatedly experience situations in which their actions seem unable to change the outcome. In some circumstances, this can contribute to a pattern known as learned helplessness. Prison is not a simple laboratory version of that phenomenon, and people's experiences vary enormously, but the broader principle matters. If you repeatedly learn that your choices have little effect, you may eventually stop expecting your choices to matter. And that can follow someone home. They might have freedom but struggle to use it. They might have opportunities but hesitate to act. They might be offered help but assume it won't last. They might have a second chance but still behave as though the old rules apply. This is where the real psychological tragedy can hide. Freedom can be physically restored before it is psychologically understood, and perhaps the strangest part is that the mind isn't necessarily betraying the person. It's trying to protect them. The brain is an adaptation machine. It takes repeated experiences and turns them into predictions. If something dangerous happened before, prepare for it next time. If trusting someone ended badly, hesitate next time. If staying alert kept you safe, stay alert. If emotional numbness reduced pain, become numb again. The brain doesn't always stop to ask whether the environment has changed. It asks what worked before. That's why change can be so difficult. You aren't simply trying to break a bad habit. You're sometimes asking an old survival system to stop doing its job. And this changes how we should think about people coming out of prison. It's easy to look at behavior from the outside and judge it. Why can't they trust people? Why are they so defensive? Why can't they just move on? But just move on assumes the mind has no memory. It does. Every repeated experience leaves expectations behind. Rebuilding a life may therefore require something deeper than simply providing a person with a door and telling them they're free. It requires opportunities to experience control again. Small choices, reliable relationships, safe environments, meaningful work, and communities where trust can develop gradually. Moments where the person makes a decision and discovers that the world responds differently now, because one of the most powerful ways to change the brain's predictions isn't through a motivational speech. It's through repeated experience. You choose and nothing terrible happens. You trust someone and they keep their word. You make a mistake and you recover. You face conflict and you discover you don't have to become dangerous to survive it. Little by little, the nervous system receives new evidence. The world has changed and maybe I can change with it, but there is something even bigger hidden inside this story. We like to believe that our personality is permanent, that we're simply confident or anxious, trusting or suspicious, ambitious or passive. Yet much of what feels like personality can also be the accumulated memory of the environments we've spent years inside, which means the question isn't always, "What's wrong with me?" Sometimes the better question is, "What kind of world taught me to become this way?" That question doesn't remove responsibility. It creates understanding. And understanding creates something responsibility alone cannot. The possibility of change. A person can leave a prison and still carry its rules inside them. But the same is true of people who have never seen a prison cell. We all carry old environments inside us. Old fears, old expectations, old definitions of safety, old versions of ourselves that were once necessary. The challenge is learning to recognize when an old survival strategy has quietly become a prison of its own, because sometimes the hardest walls to leave behind aren't made of concrete. They're made of the things your mind once learned were necessary to survive.